which had started emerging, of which the Asian Development Bank, in which Japan plays a very big role, has been in many ways the most successful. But each of your regions has a development bank that each of you would know about. Some better than others, some more significant historically than others, but that is important. So developing countries were borrowing a lot. Unfortunately, they borrowed too much. And by the mid-1980s, it was clear that many of the developing countries would not only weren't able to pay the interest on the debt, but would never be able to repay the capital either. And this created the first real debt crisis of the developing world, not just one or two countries, but much of the developing world. And it was addressed primarily by the IMF and the World Bank, which were the institutions that the rich countries trusted the most to clean up the problem. The UN was a sideshow, actually, in addressing. First of all, the UN doesn't have bigger money, whereas the IMF has access to very big money, and the World Bank has access to big money. And secondly, because the donor countries actually trusted those two institutions. And eventually, the sort of bailout worked. But it left, after a lot of bitter controversies between developing countries and industrialized countries, notably at the UN, it left both sides unfulfilled and sort of a bit bitter for very different reasons. And so a great UN Secretary General, I think we've had two great UN Secretaries General, Dag Hammarskjöld of Sweden and Kofi Annan of the UN. And Kofi felt there was a vacuum in international relations, that something should be done that was hopeful about development, that wasn't all about debt and debt repayments. And he worried his way through with some advice to thinking of the Millennium Development Goals. Many of you may remember that from your childhood. They were the first sort of global goals. They were a very rudimentary, clever, well put together group of 8 goals with an associated, perhaps 30 or so targets that could be measured if the targets were being attained or not. And finally, some indicators which would be helpful in assessing, in establishing whether the targets had been met or not. And these were quite successful. And eventually, they were overtaken by the goals we have today, the SDGs, which are very popular in Japan, I think partly for the pin, which is a very kinetic pin, probably the best international pin that's been created ever. And partly because it sounds good. But I think in most of our countries, including Japan and Canada, people don't know a great deal about the Sustainable Development Goals, and we could discuss that in the Q&A period. I want to get back to the UN. The UN was created at the San Francisco Conference in 1945. It was very much dominated by the Western powers at the outset, and pretty well until the mid-1960s. It was dominated by the Western powers. The losers of the Second World War were only allowed to join in 1955, so Japan was absent until 1955, so was Germany. And both countries, to their credit, when they entered the UN, invested a great deal in the UN. Most countries still invest a lot in the UN. And neither, because the constitution of the UN baked in the late 1940s at the San Francisco conference, there was very little that Japan and Germany contributed to the constitutional framework of the UN, and they couldn't really benefit either from their economic success later. But they've been exemplary member states, both of them, and Italy's been a good member state as well. So all of this quite recent. And in the beginning, nobody thought the UN would have much to do with development, and also nobody thought the UN would have much to do with human rights. The basics of human rights are mentioned in passing in the charter. All that's mentioned about development in one of its chapters is that it would be useful to have some reports. That was what ECOSOC, the Economic and Social Council of the UN, was to commission reports. But two things changed this. One, several people in the late 1940s who convinced Eleanor Roosevelt, the widow of President Roosevelt during the war, that this was a great project, was to champion the UN as a forum for the promotion of human rights. And it was these 3 or 4 people who wrote the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and it was Eleanor Roosevelt who advocated. She was a delegate of the United States at the UN at the time. She was the person who presented the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And as a result of this, slowly over time, the UN became a major forum internationally for human rights, as it still is. Development still nowhere very much, because that had to wait for later. But by the late 1950s, the early 1960s, partly because of all this experimental research, which revealed how much could be done to counter underdevelopment, but also because so many of the member states now were newly independent countries. The development issue came front and center again, and became much more of a component of 2 very important human rights chapters. One was the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights in 1966, and the other was the International Covenant on Economic, and Social Rights. And there was already more in that covenant about development, much more than there had been before. And progressively, as I say, development became a very major issue. Now, coming back to the UN itself, what was it up to in the 1950s? Principally, and late 40s, principally peace and security problems. There were problems in Palestine, there were problems in Kashmir, there were problems in the Middle East in 1947-48. There were some problems beginning in Africa, and the UN, particularly the Security Council, also the General Assembly, were quite busy with that. And it was only as of the mid-1960s that the UN's organs, which would become the principal organs on development, assumed prominence in the organization. So really quite recent, if you think of it. And the IBRD in Washington was still starting its transition, all about reconstruction of Europe, to being about the recently decolonized and countries and Latin American countries. And it was very enthusiastic about the transition because that transition would allow it to survive, because the reconstruction of Europe was already largely done. So one could add something that came up very saliently a bit later, which was humanitarian action. Now, humanitarian action has been with the international community for quite a long time. The International Red Cross system, the International Federation of Red Cross Societies, and various other avatars of the Red Cross movement had been around and had been doing very effective work, but the amount of need outstripped the work that the Red Cross was able to do. So increasingly, a number of UN agencies that had been created to do other things became agencies in part about humanitarian assistance of the people in greatest distress in the world. If you think of UNICEF, of course there are babies and children involved in famine, but it wasn't the famine that UNICEF was primarily meant to be dealing with. However, through the vector of children and their mothers, UNICEF turned into a major humanitarian actor. Other major humanitarian actors also transformed. The World Food Program, for example, became a highly operational provider of food in areas of great distress, food distress in the world. By the way, UNICEF and the World Food Program may be the two best UN agencies, big UN agencies, in terms of quality and outcomes, I would argue. So the four headings really today are political and security, largely Security Council, but also in the General Assembly. Human rights, which today has a high commissioner, because another thing that happened in the early 90s was the position of High Commissioner for Human Rights was created, because it was felt increasingly that human rights needed an advocate. There needed to be a person who would be the lightning rod for human rights. And the first Human Rights High Commissioner was quite cautious. He was actually elected to be cautious in the beginning, but subsequent High Commissioners have been much more outspoken, many of them women, by the way, over time. So human rights became quite important, and development has remained important as a debating point, and most UN agencies have or sponsor development programs. The UN Development Program itself is all about development programs. It had been tiny in the 1950s. It was called something else, but it was able to turn itself into a major international agency. And so the UN is very different today from what the creators thought they created. Just as the World Bank is struggling to be very different today, not just from its first avatar, but also from its second avatar, because it needs to move on now to a different, probably, approach to development. What can one say about the UN? Take the four baskets I mentioned to you. The Security Council can be very effective when it wants to be. Since about 2017, it hasn't wanted to be. But it could become very effective again if the powers with vetoes in the Council became more amicable with each other. The economic and social field is distressed, I'd say, at the UN. because how can I say, the work is very bureaucratic and diplomatic. No interesting ideas, breakthroughs, or very few, except two I'll mention in a second that are important, or that I mentioned before, sorry, that are important, the MDGs and SDGs. And they didn't come from ECOSOC or the General Assembly, they came from Kofi Annan, and then Kofi's successor in 2015. Economic and social has overall not fared very well in the UN over time. Humanitarian, I would point to as the star. I think the UN's role in humanitarian action, a lot of it copied, by the way, from the Red Cross system, it should be said, with a lot of collaboration also between the UN system and the Red Cross system. The UN's effectiveness in humanitarian action is quite impressive. Seeing what can happen in a country that has been through a drought recently, when the UN's humanitarian agencies together, NGOs that work on humanitarian distress, and the Red Cross system decide to collaborate on rescuing population from famine. It's amazing what can be done very quickly to avert famine. By the way, after each famine, one good thing is you can learn from that famine. And all of the organizations of the countries involved were from the worst famines. For example, the famine in Ethiopia about 50 years ago was a terrible famine that took many millions lives. There's a famine again in Ethiopia. It's unlikely that famine will claim millions of lives. It probably will claim too many lives, but not the millions, because the experience was useful. Just as in medicine, you learn from failure as well as success. So in operational activities, in companies, in international organizations, you learn from success and failure. So I think I'm going to stop there, having told you a bit about the UN, how it relates to the rest of the world. I haven't spoken about regional organizations. Some of them are very important. The European Union is particularly important in the European space today. Others are weaker, but still relevant to their regions. The United States plays an important normative role in the life of the Americans. So there are an infinite number of international organizations and NGOs that any of you might wind up working for, either as permanent employees or simply as contractees for a few years. And if you're interested, I encourage you to research the field because it's a big field with a lot of troubles. I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, David. Now, I have on the floor for questions and comments. Before I invite the students, I have some questions which have been submitted. And some of the questions concern the role and the position of the United States in international rights. The first question is the role of the UN concerning Ukraine and Taiwan or current issues. And related to that, what is the significance of the United Nations on ongoing crisis? They're basically the same.
Right.
And doesn't look like that the UN is losing dignity because countries are, doing what they like, right?
Countries always do what they like.
So basically, these three questions I want views about the role of international United Nations in this the current crisis.
Good. Well, I think it's a really great question because it allows us to be specific. You've probably seen the Secretary General dealing with aspects of the problem between both Moscow and Ukraine. But you probably haven't noticed somebody who's up to something much more practical that isn't even narrowly in the mandate of her organization. And this is the Secretary General of the UN Conference on Trade and Development, UNCTAD, which is a small secretariat with a fantastic leader called Rebecca Greenspan from Latin America. And Rebecca is a real achiever. And she was looking for gaps in Ukraine. What is not happening on Ukraine? And she found that what was not happening in Ukraine was serious discussion about food security and humanitarian action on both sides in the conflict. And very quietly, now it's known publicly, otherwise I would be talking about it, she spent quite a lot of time in Ukraine and Moscow speaking with leaders in both places, trying to figure out where there might be areas where both could agree that action to relieve very basic distress, absence of medicine, absence of food, absence of all these things, could make a difference. And actually, it turns out your discussions have made quite a significant difference because they impacted eventually also on Ukraine's ability to export its grain surpluses. It's a huge exporter of grain globally. Many countries in the global south, particularly a country like Egypt, but there are many others, rely on Ukrainian grain. So the side effects of what Rebecca had been doing have been extremely valuable, as well as her purpose of scoping out how citizens on both sides could be helped in a way that will not be controversial on the other side. So there you have an organization that isn't actually narrowly at the moment through its head working on trade and development, but it is doing something through Rebecca that's very, very useful. So if you Google her a bit later on, you'll find out much more about what she has been up to. Sometimes the individual is able to do things the organization would never be able to do. And then the organization gets inspired to do a bit more. But it doesn't happen often. I don't want you to believe it happens every day in the UN or anywhere else, but often times you do have the right person in the right crisis with availability, and then good things can happen. But the reality is this is a hot war. Neither side are ready settled. The UN has developed good techniques for developing peace treaties, for example, and then had confidence building measures after the peace treaties have been signed, those sorts of things, deploying sometimes civilian observers to observe that the provisions of the peace treaty are being respected, sometimes military police, sometimes peacekeepers. There are many UN techniques for how to support the willingness by two sides in a conflict, which are sometimes civil wars, be a central government and a rebel organization. Also, how you can make it possible to help these actors to settle their differences, or at least to begin settling their differences, and meanwhile also provide humanitarian assistance, if economies going again, and so on. And many other international actors participate in these activities as well. So generally you have one individual leading on a particular issue, but the organization supporting that person in their particular mission might not be their own organization, might be some other organization that wants to be the operational pillar of the outcome of the process. But so a lot of quiet diplomacy goes on. Latin Americans, by the way, are great masters of quiet diplomacy. They practice quite a lot of it internally at times, and they're very good at it in the Americas. And they're very good at it when they work in international organizations also. And you have great people from any range of countries. The greatest negotiator I have known, well, I'll name two very great ones I've known. The greatest would be Dr.David, an Algerian man who is just a hugely sensitive, clever, creative. He's now 88, alas, but he's the man who settled more wars than any other human being could claim to in the lifetime of one settle. And the other is the Latin American, Albert, what is he to remember, is Peruvian. And yes, that's his brother, Herman, who's a great economist, that is Peruvian. So Alvaro was able to disentangle the interconnected civil wars of Nicaragua, El Salvador, and Guatemala, and then propose to each of those countries ways in which they would also have to return. And that was a huge success that Alvaro, the Organization of American States, had tried to pull off. All sorts of others had been working on for years, but Alvaro did it very quickly. So individuals matter in international relations. Matter individuals if you want to be down the line. First, you have to learn the ropes and see where you'd like.
Thank you. Now, I'd like to invite from the audience for results. Hollywood microphone. Okay.
I think we saw some hands. Yes, sir. Oh, yes, sorry, microphone.
Welcome to IUJ. Two questions. The first one.
Why not just one? Because you'll have classmates who will want to ask them too.
Yeah, okay. My second question is, we're talking you talking about why we don't give Africa and maybe some kind of competition level stage. Like the African states last time in the 70s, Africa, he said like, and Africa don't have any representation and don't have any kind of like voice inside the security council. And what kind of position then is doing? So what do you think, Sega, this is for Africa?
Right, and Latin America and the Caribbean are in the same position as Africa. The UN is sclerotic in many ways. It's an old organization. What is it today, 77 years old? That's very old for an international organization. And it's not aging well for the reasons you point out, in part related to the Security Council. The Security Council composition makes very little sense relative to the world today. It makes sense relative to the world in 1945, when so many countries were still colonized. And where if you'd been choosing an African country, there were very few autonomous African countries back then. You could mention Liberia, you could mention South Africa in its former identity, but very few African countries. Egypt also did. because the winning powers of the Second World War made quite sure that it would be impossible to change the composition of the Security Council without their agreement. Because any reform of the Security Council in terms of composition needs to be approved by both the Security Council and the General Assembly, and the 500 members, any of them, can veto any resolution that comes before the Security Council. So that's the technical answer to your question. The more historical answer, I'd say, is simply the UN is very old. Its structure, in particular, no longer corresponds at all to world reality today. What you might have today would be certainly the US, China, to see what Russia is like after the Ukraine war is over, but let's include Russia. And then some others. The others certainly wouldn't be Britain and France. They might be the European Union and let the Europeans decide who represents the European Union. But there would definitely be seats for the two developing continents that don't have seats, so Africa and Latin America. Whether there would be more than one or only one, I don't know. One reason that diplomats are pretty cautious about changing things is often in changing them, you harm the little good they do. So by and large, many capitals which claim to favor Security Council reform don't do anything about it. So you know they either don't care at all, or they actually secretly know it's a good idea. Because if the council becomes too big and there are too many vetoes, the council will never decide anything. That's another argument why adding membership. So what was discussed in the last big debate, which has been going on for 20 years now on Security Council reform, was a new hybrid of the Security Council permanent member without veto. Several of the aspirant countries that were hoping they might become permanent members, offered to delay the discussion on veto or not veto for 10 years, say, after they started. But even that didn't break the logjam, and that stuck as we were 20 years ago when the conversation started. And perhaps with the Ukraine war, we're even more stuck than we were 20 years ago. Thank you. So who else? Please, sir, back there. Oh, I'm back.
No,
Good evening, Mr. Malone, and welcome to IUJ. Thank you very much for your duty lecture. I hope we could have the time to learn more from you. Actually, the unorganized question was for me, I think, but some part of the questions I want to ask. It's a general. I hope I could make it clearly. If I could not use selective political terminology,
Don't worry.
If we see the way on the crisis in the world, as since they said that the world is related unstable and dangerous. So the Jewish question has been asked. I will ask it this. If we consider the big incidents like during recent years, like the conquering of Christian Russia, and of Ukraine, and then bring
exit of UK from Europe and other incidents in the Middle East, all the crises, it looks like similar crises that World and World War II. The League of Nations and after World War II, the United Nations. It doesn't change the suppose I hope it never happens. That suppose these crises are out of control. But if it's not too easy, what the new world order after the crisis, if it happens? And the shape of this United Nations, or what would be the substitute of the United Nations? And also, if it would be an option to prevent the ongoing crisis from going out of the control, isn't it that before that happened, we think of remanaging or reforming the United Nations, be more effective on addressing ongoing international issues in the world? That because
Great. Well, let me. You've asked all good stuff. So thank you. What your question was tending towards was change. If what we have isn't working very well, how do we fix it or replace it? And that's a very bad question. It's not a frivolous question at all. After all, the League of Nations was buried without a single tear being shed. And the UN and its members need to be conscious of that. Now, creating again without a major conflict, recreating the global multilateral system would be, I would argue, extremely difficult. Would it be absolutely impossible? No. But I think unless there is a major cataclysm, nuclear war or something like that, it's more likely that we will limp along with the system we have, adapting it to the needs of the day to the extent it can be adapted, than some new organization emerging just because we aren't very happy with the old organization. Diplomacy is a very inert profession, very conservative, and new things generally either come from visionary individuals, as the European Union came from visionary individuals, and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights came from visionary individuals. They didn't come from governments, you can be sure. But generally speaking, replacing the Security Council we have, changing it, possible. Replacing it, not easy, and I would argue easier perhaps to create a whole different organization internationally and forget about the UN than trying to very significantly reform the Security Council, because it's going to meet radical opposition from countries like China, the United States, at least those two, probably if Russia is still standing, Russia also. But I think throwing away the rest of what is working reasonably well at the UN might be a mistake, because recreating it might not happen. You might be able to say, well, enough of this World Food Program and enough of UNICEF. We're going to do something else now. But would you actually be able to convince your own parliament to pay for something else now without a global cataclysm? I think not. So that's why I think, except for the Security Council, with which many people are unhappy, not just a few, we can adapt probably the rest of the system to these. But the UN Security Council is extremely difficult to reform significantly because the Permanent Five will use their vetoes if they feel their power internationally is being threatened in any way. Britain might not, France might not, although I'm not sure about France, but the other three almost certainly would, unless it was something that they had designed to get private, which is, of course, what Churchill and Roosevelt were busy doing during the Second World War. So, so if it's going on at the moment, people like you and me, I don't think it's going on at the moment. I think we would need to be in much more difficulty than we are now for governments to feel we need a completely different design for a global security council, let's say. I just don't think the political energy is there anywhere. But thank you, very good question. Who else? Please, Matt. Could you tell us who you are here? I think this works. No, probably not, because you have a mask on.
My name is Mati. I just want to ask a question. Due to the fact that UN was established in 1995 and
45.
45,
Yeah.
and at that time, science and technology was not like it is today. And at that time of the formation, it was having some mission and some visions for its formation. Do you think some of the objectives, depending on the situation that we have now or the mission, should be changed? And if should be changed, what circumstances as UN move to the new development era of this mission and the objective of the formation of the new visions and new objectives due to the change of science and technology.
Great. Well, I think science and technology related recent phenomena, do get absorbed by existing, and we do benefit from high tech and so on within the UN system. So its emergence is helpful to the UN. Obviously, it allows us to take shortcuts we couldn't take earlier. In theory, it should allow for less travel, less pollution, all the rest of it than otherwise. But I think it's the most significant transformations in the UN that are most difficult. I think humanitarian action today is so much more effective than it was 40 years ago. But because of technology, because medicine has improved greatly, our knowledge of nutritional science has improved hugely, medicines have improved hugely, all sorts of things have evolved over time, making positive international action cheaper and easier than it would have been 40 years ago. But none of them require major disruption. They're simply improvements that come about as a result of scientific breakthroughs or other knowledge breakthroughs, industrial design breakthroughs, sorts of things that allow organizations to become better at what they do operationally. But none of that addresses the problem of international politics, which have, as was pointed out earlier, have deteriorated in recent years. There was a period after the Berlin Wall fell, a period of about 4 or 5 years when the UN was empowered by governments to do and experiment a great deal more. And that included the Security Council being very supportive of the UN doing a great deal more. But some of the great deal that was done did not work particularly well. If you think of one of the UN's interventions in, or its 3 interventions, or the 3 international interventions to a great degree in Somalia, they simply didn't work. And that was a setback. The UN's efforts to resolve the civil war of the former Yugoslavia, when it became a fight, everybody against everybody amongst the former republics of the former Yugoslavia. The UN's action, which was large and expensive, did not work. What worked was NATO bombing the capital of one of the republics involved in the fighting. That worked. But diplomacy didn't work. It's not that I advocate bombing. I simply point out that the diplomacy wasn't working, and something that had nothing to do with the UN actually worked, because it convinced the people of that country they needed a new government. So I think fundamental change is what you get in international organizations is progressive change, quiet change. So all sorts of things that the UN used to work on, it doesn't work on anymore, but it works on some new things all the time. New files come up. For example, counterterrorism. Terrorism became a big concern globally in the 1970s, really, mainly focused on the Middle East initially. But then, because the Middle East was attracting a lot of attention, others thought, well, if we want to attract attention, this is a good way of doing so. And there is nothing great and small power governments fear more than terrorism. So they're extremely keen to learn more about that terrorism and try to make that operationally unattractive globally. So that's something that's happened relatively recently, and that now has an institutional home at the UN and quite a lot of activity through one of its agencies headquartered in Vienna. Do we have time for one more?
Well, I propose that, since the change the setting and we will move into the coffee tea session, and you can grab tea and coffee, tea will be served, and well, everybody can come for.
And I'll stay with you.
Yeah, and if you want to leave, okay, we are free to leave, but stay, grab a coffee or tea, and have more discussion. Stay with us, okay? That's the idea.
Thank you.
Don't leave. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thanks a lot.